Who were the Puritans?
The Puritans were members of a religious movement that began in England in the 1500s and lasted into the first half of the 1600s, when it spread to America as well. Influenced by the teachings of religious reformers John Wycliffe, c. 1330 to 1384, and John Calvin, 1509 to 1564, the Puritans were so named because they wanted to purify the Anglican Church, also known as the Church of England. They believed too much power rested with the church hierarchy, its priests, bishops, and cardinals. That the people, called the laity or lay members, should have more involvement in church matters. And that the ceremonies ought to be simplified to stress Bible reading and individual prayer. Further, they defied the authority of the Pope, believing that each church congregation should have control of its own affairs, which should be guided by a church council, called a presbytery, made up of lay members. These ideas are familiar to Americans today since they provided the basis not only for many Protestant churches but also influenced the formulation of U.S. government. When the Puritans faced persecution at home, they became religious pilgrims, traveling to the New World, where they established both their religious and social belief system.
What are the basic beliefs of Buddhism?
Buddha taught the Four Noble Truths: existence is suffering, the cause of suffering is desire. Through total transcendence, called nirvana, one may suspend suffering. And to end suffering one must follow a certain path called the Eightfold Noble Path. The path prescribes moral conduct, specifically, 1. Knowing the truth, 2. Resolving to resist evil, 3. Using speech properly so as not to hurt others, 4. Demonstrating respect for life, morality, and property through one's actions, 5. Working in a job that does not harm others, 6. Making an effort to free one's mind of evil, 7. Mindfulness, or controlling one's thoughts and feelings, and 8. Concentration. In some places, the beliefs and practices of Buddhism are combined with those of Hinduism and the Shinto religion.
Who was Montezuma?
Montezuma, or Moctezuma, was the name of two rulers of the Aztec Indians in Mexico. Montezuma I ruled an area that extended from the Atlantic to the Pacific. He is credited with enlarging Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, which is today Mexico City. He died in 1469, but 3 years earlier was succeeded by his nephew, Montezuma II, 1466 to 1520. Who is the Montezuma most people are familiar with, since it was during his reign that the Aztecs came into contact with and were eventually conquered by the Spaniards under explorer Hernán Cortés, 1485 to 1547. In 1519 Montezuma tried to persuade Cortés not to come to Mexico City. But Cortés and his troops marched inland anyway. The Aztecs rose up to fight the Spaniards, but Montezuma was wounded as he addressed his warriors. He died a few days later, on June 30, 1520, 1 year before Mexico City fell to the Spaniards.
What caused the Reformation?
The religious movement during the 16th century also had political and cultural causes. As more and more people were converted to Christianity during the Middle Ages, 500-1350, the Pope's sphere of influence gradually increased, giving him greater authority than many secular rulers. This supremacy was defended by Pope Innocent III, c. 1160 to 1216, one of the most prominent figures of the Middle Ages, who asserted that the Church should rightly retain its full power in both secular and spiritual matters. But in Western Europe, the monarchs became increasingly powerful as peasants began moving away from their farms and villages and to the emerging cities, which were protected by kings and emperors. The European monarchs often opposed the Pope, regarding him as a leader of a foreign state. This conflict continued for centuries. In 1309 Pope Clement V, c. 1260 to 1314, did something that would later divide the Roman Catholic Church when, being French himself, he moved the papacy from Rome to Avignon, France, where it stayed for 70 years. When Pope Gregory XI, 1329 to 1378, moved it back to Rome in 1377, some French cardinals objected and elected a pope of their own, an anti-pope, installing him at Avignon. This resulted in two popes claiming supremacy. And in 1409 the situation grew more complicated when a third pope was added in Pisa, Italy. Not only had the power struggle divided the Church, it had created tremendous confusion for the people, who further perceived that there were corrupt practices at work in the Church. These included the selling of church positions and indulgences, pardons for sins, as well as the lavish lifestyle enjoyed by the bishops and the Pope, which was on a par with that of royalty. While these injustices were decried by critics, the abuses did not stop. As a remedy, some began to think that the Church should be led not by the Pope but by church councils. Dissatisfaction with the Church also extended to its message, which had turned away from God's mercy and the teachings of Jesus Christ, instead focusing on a life of good works as the way to salvation. Europe was also in the midst of the Renaissance, 1350 to 1600, which saw a proliferation in the number of universities, the circulation of printed materials, thanks to the advent of the movable type printing press, and broader study of classic texts as well as of the Holy Scriptures in their original languages instead of how they had been handed down in translation by the Church. Before long, a middle class of educated people emerged in Europe. These circumstances combined to bring about a period of religious reform that lasted until 1648. the movement itself, however, continued to exert influence through its emphasis on personal responsibility, individual freedom, and the secularization of society.
Who were the conquistadors?
Conquistador is the Spanish word for conqueror. The Spaniards who arrived in North and South America in the late 1400s and early 1500s were just that, conquerors of the American Indians and their lands. In many cases, the Spaniards were the first Europeans to arrive in these lands, where they encountered native inhabitants including the Aztec of Mexico, the Maya of southern Mexico and Central America, and the Inca of western South America. By the mid-1500s these native peoples had been conquered, their populations decimated by the Spanish conquistadors. The conquest happened in two ways. First, the Spaniards rode on horseback and carried guns, while their native opponents were on foot and carried crude weapons such as spears and knives. And second, the European adventurers brought illnesses, such as smallpox and measles, to which the native populations of the Americas had no immunities, causing the people to become sick and die. By 1535 conquistadors such as Francisco Pizarro, c. 1475 to 1541, Hernan Cortés, 1485 to 1547, and Vasco Núñez de Balboa, 1475 to 1519, had claimed the southwestern United States, Mexico, Central America, and much of the West Indies, islands of the Caribbean, for Spain.
How is the current era characterized?
Ask the question of most any observer, and the answer would include catchphrases like global marketplace, global village, or globalization. Modern communications and transportation connect people as never before. Businesses enjoy broader markets for their goods and services. Manufacturing facilities and jobs are located far from the offices of the companies that market them, and people of many nationalities, races, and religions have more and more contact with one another every day, for business and pleasure. Some observers worry that this contact will blur rich cultural differences, diluting diversity. Others say that globalization will bring tolerance and increase understanding. Whatever the case, we are living our lives on a global stage. The things we buy and use are as likely to carry "Made in China" or "Made in Mexico" labels as they are any other. People continents away talk to each other not just over the telephone, but via cell phones. Instant messages, email, and internet chat rooms. We have an international forum, the internet, for buying, selling, and publishing, and we can get almost anywhere in the world with all due haste. Everything travels faster today, including ideas. The upsides are many. Modern communications and transportation made it possible, for example, for the world to mobilize aid to victims of the Southeast Asian tsunami of December 2004. But there are downsides as well. Critics say globalization is fueling the exploitation of workers in developing nations, contributing to a modern slave trade, rapidly depleting resources, and wiping out environmental diversity. These are some of the reasons protesters have demonstrated outside meetings of the World Trade Organization. Why some people opposed the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, and oppose the pending CAFTA, Central American Free Trade Agreement. And why many people dislike that American popular culture is marketed around the world. The problem could be distilled to this: diversity versus homogeneity. And the resulting culture clashes are not restricted to the realm of scholarly thought. They are making headline news. The enemy is no longer the strong-armed, nuclear-fortified, absolutist government of the Cold War era. Though, as of mid-2005, North Korea remained a serious concern, the enemy. As the U.S. State Department reminds us, is any group of individuals with extreme views.
What was the Reformation?
It was a religious movement in Europe during the 16th and 17th centuries. It fomented inside the Catholic Church as people began questioning the Church's doctrines, practices, and authority. While the movement was preceded by a swelling dissatisfaction with the Church, the Reformation was officially, and some would say abruptly, begun in October 1517 when German monk and theology professor Martin Luther, 1483–1546, nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the castle church at Wittenberg, Saxony, Germany, launching an attack on the church. The movement continued through the 30 Years' War, 1618–48. And though the resolution to that conflict brought about a measure of religious stability in Europe, the force of the Reformation did not end there. Both the freedom of dissent and the Protestantism people know today are the byproducts of the movement.
How was Cortés able to claim Mexico for the Spaniards?
On behalf of the European power, Hernán Cortés, 1485–1547, claimed Mexico after conquering its native peoples. In 1519 Cortés landed on the eastern coast of Mexico and founded the city of Veracruz. From there he marched inland, making an alliance with the Tlaxcalan Indians, who had fought wars against the powerful Aztecs in central Mexico. On November 8 of that year, Cortés marched into Mexico City, then named Tenochtitlan, and took the Aztec leader, Montezuma, hostage. Cortés then continued to Mexico's west coast. When he returned to Mexico City in the central part of the country in 1520, he found the Aztecs in revolt against the Spaniards. Fierce fighting ensued, and by the end of June Montezuma was dead. This period of warfare is still remembered today by Mexicans as La Noche Triste, the sorrowful night. It was not until the following year, in August 1521, that Cortés, after a 4-month battle, claimed Mexico City, and the land came under control of the Spanish.
What were the results of the Reformation?
The emergence of the Protestants, who got their name for protesting against the Catholic Church, was officially recognized by Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, 1500–1558, with the Peace of Augsburg, 1555, which granted the people the right to worship as Lutherans, the church named for reformer Martin Luther 1483–1546. But the hostility between Catholic and Protestant countries erupted in 1618 with the 30 Years' War. That series of conflicts, which had become increasingly political as it raged, was ended with the Peace of Westphalia, which, among other things, stipulated that Lutheranism and Calvinism, or Presbyterianism, founded by Frenchman John Calvin 1509–64, be given the same due as Catholicism. Through acts of state, both Catholicism and Protestantism took hold in Europe, with the northern countries, including those of Scandinavia, turning toward the new churches and the southern countries remaining Catholic. For the most part, the Reformation fostered an attitude of religious tolerance among Christians. However, conflict would continue, to the present day, in the British Isles, after Queen Elizabeth I, 1533–1603, adopted a moderate form of Protestantism, called Anglicanism, as the official religion of England. English Protestants colonized Ulster, northern Ireland, and in so doing gave rise to hostilities with their Irish Catholic countrymen to the south. For its part, the Catholic Church, too, underwent a period of reform, called the Counter-Reformation, which rid the Church of many of its pre-Reformation problems to emerge as a stronger religious body. The Reformation had without question brought about greater religious freedom than had been known before. Among the churches that emerged during the Reformation are the Lutheran, the Anabaptist, ancestors to the Amish and Mennonite churches, the Presbyterian, the Episcopal, and the Congregational and Unitarian, formerly Puritan, all of which have strong followings today, both in Europe and in North America, where they were established by the colonists.
What was the Counter-Reformation?
Also called the Catholic Reformation, it was the Roman Catholic Church's response to the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century. Some parishioners and members of the Roman Catholic clergy had already been calling for reforms within the Church for more than 2 centuries when in 1517 German monk and theology professor Martin Luther, 1483–1546, nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the castle church at Wittenberg, Saxony, Germany. His theses attacked the doctrines and authority of the Church, sparking the Reformation. The movement's leaders, called Protestants because they protested against the Catholic Church, changed the religious landscape of Europe by creating new Christian churches. But a movement to make changes inside the Catholic Church also began. The turning point came in 1534 when Paul III, 1468 to 1549, became Pope. Realizing that the Church must respond to what it viewed as a religious crisis, Pope Paul convened the Council of Trent, in Italy, which was charged with reviewing all aspects of religious life. The ecumenical group met from 1545 to 1547, 1551 to 1552, and 1562 to 1563. And out of those deliberations emerged the modern Catholic Church. The Counter-Reformation was aided by a group of priests and brothers known as the Jesuits. Members of the Society of Jesus, a religious order of the Roman Catholic Church. The Jesuits were instrumental in spreading the word of the reforms and in promoting a new spirit within the Catholic Church.
What was the diet of worms?
In 1521 a diet, which is another word for an imperial council or an assembly of princes, was convened at Worms, situated on the Rhine River in Germany. This particular meeting had been called by Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, 1500–1558, to consider the crisis that had been brought on by the Reformation. Since Martin Luther, 1483–1546, was instrumental in both igniting the movement and furthering its causes, he was called before the Diet to testify and defend himself. But the religious leader refused to yield his stance. He vowed to continue to make his argument against the Church. He closed his statement with these famous words, "Here I stand. I cannot do otherwise. God help me. Amen." The result of this was that on May 25 the Edict of Worms was issued, declaring Martin Luther an outlaw. However, Luther sought refuge in the protection of Frederick the Wise. And the edict itself served only to galvanize the cause of the reformers.
How did the Soviet Union fall apart?
Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev's, 1931, liberal reforms met with the opposition of conservative communist officials who were angered by the hardships produced by the transition to a free market economy and dissatisfied with the Soviet Union's loss of influence over neighboring countries, where communism had fallen by 1990. On August 19, 1991, communists attempted to overthrow Gorbachev as president of the Soviet Union. Though the effort failed in the face of widespread public opposition, it nevertheless weakened Gorbachev's leadership. Soon the 15 Soviet republics declared independence but indicated their willingness to become part of a loose confederation of former Soviet republics. Though Gorbachev tried to prevent the complete dissolution of the Soviet Union. On December 8, 1991, the republics of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus broke away completely from the Soviet Union and formed the Commonwealth of Independent States. All the remaining republics, except Georgia, followed suit. On December 25, Gorbachev resigned as president, and the Soviet Union ceased to exist. With continuing reforms in Eastern Europe and the end of the Soviet Union, by 1992 the only communist-dominated countries that remained were, with the exception of Cuba, Asian nations, China, Laos, North Korea, and Vietnam.
What were the 7 cities of Cibola?
The reference is to an area in present-day northern New Mexico that was thought by early Spanish explorers to contain vast treasures. One expedition in search of these legendary golden cities was that led by Francisco Vázquez de Coronado, c. 1510 to 1554, who sought to claim the riches for Spain. In 1540 he set out from North Galicia, a province northwest of Mexico City, with some 300 Spanish troops as well as some Indians. They made it into the region where Arizona and New Mexico lie today. There they encountered Zuni Indian settlements and believed these to be Cibola. The Spaniards captured the Zuni, who were the descendants of the Anasazi cliff dwellers that had settled the southwest as early as 10,000 BC. The Spaniards found no gold at the Zuni settlement. Separate expeditions set out, still hoping to locate riches in the area. They did not find any precious metals, but they did make some discoveries. They were the first Europeans to see the Grand Canyon, to travel up the Rio Grande Valley, and to encounter several native peoples living in the region. In 1546 Coronado was accused of cruelty in his treatment of these peoples.
Who is the Dalai Lama?
The Dalai Lama is the spiritual leader of Lamaism, a Buddhist sect in Tibet. The title, first bestowed on a Lamaist leader in 1578. Translates as teacher whose wisdom is great as the ocean. The title has been bestowed 13 times since. Followers believe that the Dalai Lama is continually reborn. Monks go in search of a young boy who was born at about the same time as the Dalai Lama died. They seek other signs of continuity as well before identifying the new Dalai Lama, who the monks educate and train to assume the leadership role.
How did America get its name?
America is derived from the name of Italian navigator Amerigo Vespucci, 1454–1512, who took part in several early voyages to the New World. Vespucci had been a merchant in service of the Medici family in Florence, and later moved to Spain, where he worked for the company that outfitted the ships for Christopher Columbus's 1451–1506 second and third voyages. He sailed with the Spaniards on several expeditions, in 1497, 1499, 1501, and 1503. Though scholars today question his role as an explorer, in a work by German geographer Martin Waldseemüller, c. 1470 c. 1520, published in 1507, the author credited Vespucci with realizing that he had actually arrived in a new world, not in the Far East as other explorers, including Columbus, had believed. Thus, Waldseemüller suggested the new lands be named America after Amerigo Vespucci. For his part, Waldseemüller was led to believe this by Vespucci himself, who had written to Lorenzo de' Medici in 1502 or 1503, relaying his discovery of a new continent and vividly describing it. About a year later, the letter was published under the title Mundus Novus, New World, which was translated and published in future editions. The designation America was used again in 1538 by Flemish cartographer Gerardus Mercator. Gerhard Kremer, 1512–1594. Today the term in the singular refers to either continent in the Western Hemisphere and sometimes specifically to the United States. In the plural, it refers to all of the lands of the Western Hemisphere, including North and South America and the West Indies.
How are religions classified?
Religion, which is a system of beliefs that usually centers on whatever is beyond the known or the natural, is commonly divided between elementary forms and higher religions. Some elementary forms, or traditional religions, are animism, the belief in spirits in nature or in natural objects, ancestor worship, revering the spirits of the dead, and totemism, belief in a mystical relationship between a group of people and an emblem. Animists might believe in spirits living in the sea or in the mountains. Believers in ancestor worship will both honor and fear the spirits of dead family members for if they are neglected by the living. These spirits are believed to be able to bring harm to their descendants. Within clans, some tribal peoples adopt totems, such as a lion or a turtle. Totemists will be careful throughout their lives not to harm the animal or object that serves as their clan's emblem. Higher religions are those that embody a concept of transcendence. Higher religions are classified as polytheistic, believing in many gods, dualistic, believing in equally powerful gods of good and evil, monotheistic, believing in one God, and pantheistic, believing in God as the forces and laws of the universe, or the worship of all gods. Religions are further classified as revealed or non-revealed. Revealed religions are those that followers know through divine agency. Both Christianity and Islam are revealed religions. Non-revealed religions, such as Buddhism, Brahmanism, or Taoism, are known only through inquiry.
What led to the decline of communism in Eastern Europe?
Anti-communist sentiment among Eastern Europeans was bolstered by the actions and policies of Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, 1931. When Gorbachev took office in 1985, the Soviet economy was in decline. In order to reverse the trend, he advocated dramatic reforms to move the economy away from the government-controlled communist system and toward a decentralized system, similar to those of Western democracies. Gorbachev's efforts to modernize the Soviet Union were not limited to the economy. He further proposed a reduction in the power of the Communist Party, which had controlled the country since 1917. Gorbachev's programs for reform were termed perestroika, meaning restructuring. In the meantime, Gorbachev opened up relations with the West, which included visits with U.S. President Ronald Reagan. 1911 to 2004, who strongly supported the Soviet leaders' programs. Gorbachev referred to his policy of openness as glasnost. Both Russian terms quickly caught on around the world. While the economic reforms produced a slow and painful change for the Soviet people, and Gorbachev had many detractors, including government officials. He also had many supporters both inside and outside the Soviet Union. People in other Eastern European countries watched with interest the Soviet move toward a more democratic system. Strikes in Poland had begun as early as 1980, where workers formed a free labor union called Solidarity. But the following year, the communist leaders of the Soviet Union pressured the Polish government to put an end to the movement, which it did. After Gorbachev became head of the Soviet Union and initiated sweeping changes, the reform movements in other countries soon realized that the Soviets under Gorbachev would no longer take hard-handed tactics toward anti-communist efforts in other countries. In 1989, the Polish government ceased to prohibit Solidarity, and the Communist Party there lost influence. The same was true in Hungary, East Germany, and Czechoslovakia. By the end of the decade, most of the Eastern European communist governments were overthrown in favor of democratic-oriented governments. The transition was effected differently in each country. The overthrow in Czechoslovakia was so peaceful that it was called the Velvet Revolution, while in Romania a bloody revolt ensued, and hardline communist dictator Nicolae Ceausescu, 1918 to 1989, was executed. In 1990, multi-party elections were held in Romania, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, East Germany, and Bulgaria. The non-communist party that was put in power in East Germany agreed to unification with West Germany, again creating one Germany on October 3. 1990. That same year Gorbachev received the Nobel Peace Prize for his contributions to world peace.
When was the Bible translated into English?
The earliest English-language translations of any part of the Bible first appeared around the 8th century. The Vespasian Psalter was a primitive English translation of the Latin text of the Book of Psalms. But the Latin translation of the Bible, called the Vulgate, continued to prevail for several centuries as the version authorized by the Roman Catholic Church. It was not until the 1300s that the first comprehensive translation into English was undertaken by the controversial religious reformer John Wycliffe, c. 1330–1384. Wycliffe, an English theologian and professor at Oxford University, was a forerunner of the Protestant Reformation. He believed that all authority, religious and secular, can be derived only from God. And he attacked the worldliness of the medieval church. In 1377 Pope Gregory XI, 1329–1378, accused Wycliffe of heresy, but the reformer escaped trial. Nevertheless, he spent the rest of his life under the watchful eye of the Church, which did everything in its power to curtail Wycliffe's activities, eventually forcing him to retire. He managed to initiate the first complete translation of the Bible, which was finished by his followers. As an early leader of the Reformation, the Anglican priest William Tyndale, c. 1494–1536, believed that the scriptures needed to be available to everyone, not just the scholarly or learned. So he began translating the New Testament and the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, from Greek and Hebrew into English. He also referred to his friend Martin Luther's, 1483–1546, German translation of the Bible. But Tyndale was unable to get his English translation published at home in England, where the Anglican Church was determined to seize the work. In 1524 he fled the country for Germany, where he worked for the next 5 years to get his translations into print. Copies of it were smuggled back into England. Eventually he was arrested in Antwerp, Belgium, and condemned for heresy by the Roman Catholic Church. Tyndale was burned at the stake in 1536. His version later became the chief basis for the King James Version of the Bible, 1611.
Who is the enemy of the day?
Terrorists. News stories reinforce that this catch-all term does not only include the 9/11 hijackers and their Al-Qaeda associates, the Madrid and London train bombers, and suicide bombers in Gaza, but anti-government extremists who blew up a federal building in Oklahoma City, a still unknown distributor of deadly anthrax, and animal rights activists who routinely damage property to make a point. Terrorism is a decades, some might argue, centuries, old problem. Remember Birmingham, Alabama's 16th Street Baptist Church. Bombed in 1963 by white supremacists during Sunday services. Remember the 1972 Summer Olympics in Munich, when the Arab terrorist group Black September killed 11 Israeli athletes held captive in the Olympic Village. Remember the October 1985 hijacking of the Achille Lauro cruise ship by members of the Palestinian Liberation Front, who killed a wheelchair-bound American Jew. Remember the December 1988 bombing of Pan Am Flight 103, which came down in Lockerbie, Scotland, claiming 270 lives. The list is long and growing. The shocking events of September 11, 2001, centered the world's attention on the problem of well-financed terrorist networks that can turn the freedoms of democracy against civilians and who are feared to have in their possession or access to powerful weapons of mass destruction, WMD. The events of that day launched what the US government calls the global war on terrorism. A long battle that even the president acknowledged may not be winnable in a traditional sense. This is a new kind of war, fought not against a nation, but against anarchists halfway around the world. And in our midst, globalization and terrorism are the twin concerns of the modern era.
What was the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre?
It was a mass murder in 1572, which began on August 24, the Roman Catholic feast day of St. Bartholomew. The slaughter, which eventually claimed an estimated 70,000 lives, was part of decades of civil wars between Roman Catholics and Protestants, Huguenots, in France. The Protestant Reformation had begun in 1517, and it spread through Europe over the following decades. By the 1560s as many as one-third of the French people were Protestants. The growth of a Reformed Christian faith threatened the Roman Catholic Church and eroded its power, both religious and political. In 1560 Charles IX, 1550–1574, a Roman Catholic, rose to power in France. But since he was just 10 years old at the time, the country was ruled by a regent, his mother, Catherine de' Medicis, 1519–1589. Catherine was a descendant of the powerful Medici family of Florence and, as the wife of King Henry II, 1519–1559, the Queen of France. Even after Charles IX reached the age of majority, she continued to dominate him. By 1572 Catherine feared the growing influence that another person, Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, 1519–1572, had on her son, the king. Coligny was a leader of the Huguenots, the French Protestants, and, in fact, he did hold sway over Charles IX. To remove this threat, Catherine authorized a plot by Roman Catholic nobles to assassinate Coligny. On August 18, Catherine's daughter, Margaret of Valois, 1553–1615. Was married to Henry of Navarre, 1553–1610, a Huguenot. The royal event brought many Huguenot nobles to Paris. On August 22, an attempt was made on Coligny's life, but he survived. Catherine feared that an investigation into the attack on Coligny would reveal her role in it. She therefore gave approval to a wider plan to exterminate Huguenots. And she convinced her son, Charles IX, to order it. According to French statesman and historian Jacques-Auguste de Thou, 1553–1617. The order stated that it was the will of the king that, according to God's will, they should take vengeance on the band of rebels the Huguenots while they had the beasts in the toils. The massacre began with the toll of a palace bell on August 24. Those who carried out the killings on the Huguenot leaders identified themselves with white armbands and a white cross on their hats. Coligny was among the first victims, but Protestants throughout Paris were targeted. As citizens became involved in the mayhem, several thousand perished in the city, causing the waters of the river Seine to run red. Throughout the provinces over the next several weeks, thousands more died, the victims of mob attacks on Protestants. News of the attacks was greeted with approval by Roman Catholic leaders. Protestants throughout Europe were horrified. The plot carried out on St. Bartholomew's Day had launched a mass extermination, fueling the hatred between Catholics and Protestants.
Who are the Jesuits?
The Jesuits are members of a Roman Catholic religious order called the Society of Jesus. The group was founded by Saint Ignatius of Loyola, 1491–1556. Born into nobility as Inigo de Onís y Loyola, the Spaniard became a knight in 1517. In that capacity he fought against the French in their siege 1521 of Pamplona, northeast of Madrid. But he was seriously wounded in the battle and retreated to a commune in northeast Spain from 1522 to 1523. There Ignatius heard a religious calling and subsequently undertook a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, 1523 to 1524. Committed to a religious life, he embarked on a program of disciplined writing and study in Spain and in Paris, France. Even before he was ordained in 1537, Ignatius had gained followers. The Spanish missionary Francis Xavier, 1506–1552, among them. With his companions Ignatius founded the Society of Jesus in 1539, the religious order was approved by Pope Paul III, 1468–1549, the following year. Jesuits are known for leading structured lives and for their self-discipline, commitment to the Pope, and missionary work. They have a profound belief in education, and as such have long been leaders in learning and in the sciences. The order was suppressed in 1773 but restored in 1814.
Where did Christopher Columbus first land in the New World?
Columbus, 1451 to 1506, set sail from Palos, in southwest Spain. On August 3, 1492, and he sighted land on October 12 that year. Going ashore, he named it San Salvador. Alternately called Wudeling's Island, today it is one of the Bahamas. With his fleet of 3 vessels, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, Columbus then continued west and south. Sailing along the north coast of Cuba and Haiti, which he named Hispaniola. When the Santa Maria ran aground, Columbus left a colony of about 40 men on the Haitian coast where they built a fort. Which, being Christmas time, they named La Navidad. Navidad means Christmas in Spanish. In January 1493 he set sail for home, arriving back in Palos on March 15 with a few Indians. Native Americans, as well as some belts, aprons, bracelets, and gold on board. News of his successful voyage spread rapidly, and Columbus journeyed to Barcelona, Spain, where he was triumphantly received by Ferdinand and Isabella. On his second voyage, which he undertook on September 25, 1493, he sailed with a fleet of 17 ships and some 1,500 men. In November he reached Dominica, Guadeloupe, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands. Upon returning to Haiti, Hispaniola, Columbus found the colony at La Navidad had been destroyed by natives. In December 1493 he made a new settlement at Isabela, present-day Dominican Republic. The eastern end of Hispaniola, which became the first European town in the New World. Before returning to Spain in 1496, Columbus also landed at Jamaica. On his third voyage, which he began in May 1498, Columbus reached Trinidad, just off the coast of South America. On his fourth and last trip he found the island of Martinique before arriving on the North American mainland at Honduras, in Central America. It was also on this voyage, in May 1502, that he sailed down to the Isthmus of Panama, finally believing himself to be near China. But Columbus suffered many difficulties, and in November 1504 he returned to Spain for good. He died 2 years later in poverty and neglect. He had, of course, never found the westward sea passage to the Indies in the Far East. Nevertheless, the Caribbean islands he discovered came to be known collectively as the West Indies. And the native peoples of North and South America came to be known collectively as Indians.
How old is Buddhism?
One of the great Asian religions, Buddhism dates back to ancient times. It was founded in India in the 6th and 5th centuries B.C. by Siddhartha Gautama, c. 563–c. 483 BC, who became known as Buddha, or Enlightened One. Born in what is today Nepal, Siddhartha's father is described in stories as a king or a warrior prince, and the family lived in luxury. When he was 29 years old, Siddhartha had a series of 4 visions that prompted him to leave his wife, young son, and the palace and venture out in search of spiritual enlightenment and truth. He wandered for 6 years, traveling to the ancient kingdom of Magadha, in present-day India. During this time he led a life of extreme austerity and even self-torture. He finally decided that his ascetic life would not lead him to truth, and he abandoned his practice of self-denial. One day, when he was 35 years old, Siddhartha went to meditate under a banyan, shade, tree, also called a Bodhi tree. There he claimed to achieve enlightenment. Thereafter, Buddha traveled through the Ganges River valley, teaching meditation and adherence to moral conduct as the way to enlightenment. He established a community of monks to continue his work. Buddhism is the world's 4th largest religion, after Christianity, Islam, and Hinduism. Most of the estimated 360 million Buddhists in the world today live in Asia, Sri Lanka, Southeast Asia, and Japan, predominantly.
Why is mythology so widely studied?
The mythologies of various peoples are studied for their religious meanings, for their similarities to each other, and as a way of understanding the culture that originated them. Through the centuries, scholars have arrived at various conclusions about mythology. Scottish anthropologist Sir James Frazer, 1854–1941. Studied folklore and religion and found parallel beliefs between the systems of primitive cultures and Christianity. He published his theories in the highly influential work titled The Golden Bough, 1890. Proposing that all myths center on the cycles of nature and birth, death, and resurrection. Polish-born English anthropologist Bronislaw Malinowski, 1884–1942. Asserted that myths are nothing more than the validation of accepted social behavior and patterns within a culture. Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung, 1875–1961, posited that all cultures have unconsciously formed the same mythic symbols or motifs, called archetypes. To many theologians, mythologies are viewed simply as corruptions of the Bible. Whatever their meaning or however they are interpreted. Myths have figured prominently in literature from the 5th century BC works of Greek tragedy on Aeschylus to the 20th century works of poets T.S. Eliot and Wallace Stevens.
What was the importance of Martin Luther's 95 Theses?
The The Reformation as a movement began on October 31, 1517, when the German monk and theology professor Martin Luther 1483–1546, nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the castle church at Wittenberg, Saxony, Germany. The Theses, which are arguments or assertions, question the value of indulgences. The pardons that were disseminated by the Church, and condemned the sale of them. Luther had already begun to preach the doctrine of salvation by faith rather than by works. And during 1518 he went on to publicly defend his beliefs, which were in direct opposition to the Church. The following year he expanded his argument against the Church by denying the supremacy of the Pope. In 1521 Pope Leo X, 1475–1521, declared Luther a heretic and excommunicated him. Ordered to appear before the Diet of Worms in April 1521, Luther refused to retract his statements of his beliefs, saying, "Unless I am convinced by the testimony of the Scriptures or by clear reason, I am bound by the Scriptures I have quoted, and my conscience is captive to the Word of God." The following month, Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, 1500–1558, issued the Edict of Worms, declaring Luther to be an outlaw and authorizing his death. But the Prince of Saxony, known by history as Frederick the Wise, 1463–1525, saw fit to protect Luther, whom he had appointed as a faculty member at the University of Wittenberg. Founded by Frederick the Wise in 1502. There Luther translated the New Testament into German and undertook a translation of the entire Bible. Luther continued the Protestant movement until his death in 1546.
Besides the native peoples, what discoveries did the Europeans make in the New World?
The new lands of the Western Hemisphere yielded many plants unknown in Europe. On Christopher Columbus's first voyage in 1492 he became the first European to discover maize, corn, sweet potatoes, capsicums, peppers, plantains, and pineapples. Subsequent expeditions found potatoes, wild rice, squash, tomatoes, cacao, chocolate beans, peanuts, cashews, and tobacco. These plants, many of which had been developed and cultivated by the American Indians, were carried back to Europe, and their cultivation spread to suitable climates throughout the world.
What became of John Cabot's son, Sebastian?
Sebastian, c. 1476–1557, who was born in Bristol, England, and sailed with his father on his successful expedition to North America the summer of 1497. Did not take part in his father's ill-fated venture the following year. Had he done so, the world would have lost another great adventurer. Since that expedition was never heard from again. Instead, Sebastian stayed behind and pursued his father's cause and that of other merchant navigators, who were determined to find overseas trade routes to the east. During his lifetime, Sebastian Cabot drew up maps for both the English and Spanish royalty, and from 1525 to 1528 led a Spanish expedition that reached South America's Rio de la Plata, and sailed into the Parana and Paraguay rivers. In 1544 Cabot published an engraved map of the world, and 7 years later, under a pension from King Edward VI. 1537 to 1553, he founded the Merchant Adventurers of London. This group sponsored expeditions seeking a northeast passage around Europe to establish a trading route to the east. In so doing, the group effected trade with Russia.
What became of John Cabot's son, Sebastian?
Sebastian, c. 1476 to 1557, who was born in Bristol, England, and sailed with his father on his successful expedition to North America the summer of 1497. Did not take part in his father's ill-fated venture the following year. Had he done so, the world would have lost another great adventurer. Since that expedition was never heard from again. Instead, Sebastian stayed behind and pursued his father's cause and that of other merchant navigators, who were determined to find overseas trade routes to the east. During his lifetime, Sebastian Cabot drew up maps for both the English and Spanish royalty, and from 1525 to 1528 led a Spanish expedition that reached South America's Rio de la Plata, and sailed into the Parana and Paraguay rivers. In 1544 Cabot published an engraved map of the world, and 7 years later, under a pension from King Edward VI. 1537 to 1553, he founded the Merchant Adventurers of London. This group sponsored expeditions seeking a northeast passage around Europe to establish a trading route to the east. In so doing, the group effected trade with Russia.
How long was it before someone reached the east by sailing west?
It was not until 1520 that a route was found. Portuguese navigator Ferdinand Magellan, c. 1480 to 1521, was on an expedition for Spain when he found a southwest passage, which took him around the southern tip of South America, through a winding waterway that still bears his name, the Strait of Magellan. Having set out from Spain in September 1519, it was a full year later before Magellan, born Fernando de Magalhães, and known in Spain as Fernando de Magallanes, reached this point. South of the South American mainland and north of the Tierra del Fuego island chain, today these islands are part of Argentina and Chile. And this was only after he had crushed a mutiny. Nevertheless, Magellan had found a connection between the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. He sailed on from there, reaching the island we know as Guam on March 6, 1521. 10 days later, he discovered the Philippines. On the Philippine island of Cebu, he made an alliance with a treacherous native sovereign for whom he undertook an expedition to the nearby island of Mactan. It was there that Magellan met with his death in April 1521. His expedition continued without him. Under the direction of Juan Sebastián de Elcano, c. 1476 to 1526, who in 1522 returned to Seville, Spain. Along with 18 other survivors of the Magellan expedition. Their cargo, aboard the ship Victoria, included valuable spices which more than paid for the expense of the expedition.
How long was it before someone reached the east by sailing west?
It was not until 1520 that a route was found. Portuguese navigator Ferdinand Magellan, c. 1480 to 1521, was on an expedition for Spain when he found a southwest passage, which took him around the southern tip of South America, through a winding waterway that still bears his name, the Strait of Magellan. Having set out from Spain in September 1519, it was a full year later before Magellan, born Fernando de Magalhães, and known in Spain as Fernando de Magallanes, reached this point. South of the South American mainland and north of the Tierra del Fuego island chain, today these islands are part of Argentina and Chile. And this was only after he had crushed a mutiny. Nevertheless, Magellan had found a connection between the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. He sailed on from there, reaching the island we know as Guam on March 6, 1521. 10 days later, he discovered the Philippines. On the Philippine island of Cebu, he made an alliance with a treacherous native sovereign for whom he undertook an expedition to the nearby island of Mactan. It was there that Magellan met with his death in April 1521. His expedition continued without him. Under the direction of Juan Sebastián de Elcano, c. 1476 to 1526, who in 1522 returned to Seville, Spain. Along with 18 other survivors of the Magellan expedition. Their cargo, aboard the ship Victoria, included valuable spices which more than paid for the expense of the expedition.
Who was the first Englishman to circumnavigate the globe?
It was English Admiral Sir Francis Drake, 1540 or 1543 to 1596. Who set out in 1577 to explore the Strait of Magellan. He did so, investigating the coast of South America. He and his crew plundered coastal Chile and Peru in the process. Before continuing into the South Pacific and heading northward, he eventually reached the coast of present-day California, which he named New Albion. A name that did not stick, and claimed it for Queen Elizabeth I, 1533 to 1603. He continued sailing northward and is believed to have reached Vancouver still in search of the Northwest Passage. Not finding it, he was much too far south, explorers would later learn. He sailed westward. He reached the so-called Spice Islands, today known as the Moluccas, in East Indonesia in 1579. Drake also found the Indonesian island of Java. Before continuing west through the Indian Ocean, rounding the southern tip of South Africa at the Cape of Good Hope and skirting the western coast of Africa northward to Sierra Leone. From there Drake returned home to Plymouth, England, where he landed in 1580, the first Englishman to travel around the world. He was knighted by the Queen 1 year later. It is also Drake who, along with his fellow countryman Sir Walter Raleigh, 1554 to 1618, bears the dubious honor of introducing tobacco to his homeland. In 1586 Drake returned from another expedition to North and South America, where he did battle with Spanish fleets for control of lands. He then picked up colonists in Virginia, who carried with them potatoes and the materials and implements for tobacco smoking. Drake remained in the service of the Queen for his whole life, going on to fight and defeat the Spanish Armada in 1588. On a mission to the West Indies in 1596, Drake died on board his own ship.
Who was the first Englishman to circumnavigate the globe?
It was English Admiral Sir Francis Drake, 1540 or 1543 to 1596. Who set out in 1577 to explore the Strait of Magellan. He did so, investigating the coast of South America. He and his crew plundered coastal Chile and Peru in the process. Before continuing into the South Pacific and heading northward, he eventually reached the coast of present-day California, which he named New Albion. A name that did not stick, and claimed it for Queen Elizabeth I, 1533 to 1603. He continued sailing northward and is believed to have reached Vancouver still in search of the Northwest Passage. Not finding it, he was much too far south, explorers would later learn. He sailed westward. He reached the so-called Spice Islands, today known as the Moluccas, in East Indonesia in 1579. Drake also found the Indonesian island of Java. Before continuing west through the Indian Ocean, rounding the southern tip of South Africa at the Cape of Good Hope and skirting the western coast of Africa northward to Sierra Leone. From there Drake returned home to Plymouth, England, where he landed in 1580, the first Englishman to travel around the world. He was knighted by the Queen 1 year later. It is also Drake who, along with his fellow countryman Sir Walter Raleigh, 1554 to 1618, bears the dubious honor of introducing tobacco to his homeland. In 1586 Drake returned from another expedition to North and South America, where he did battle with Spanish fleets for control of lands. He then picked up colonists in Virginia, who carried with them potatoes and the materials and implements for tobacco smoking. Drake remained in the service of the Queen for his whole life, going on to fight and defeat the Spanish Armada in 1588. On a mission to the West Indies in 1596, Drake died on board his own ship.
Who was the first to go around the world?
YC, the first to circumnavigate the globe was the Basque navigator Juan Sebastián de Elcano, c. 1476 to 1526, though 18 sailors who made the trip with him also claim the distinction. The trip was completed in 1522 and had taken nearly 3 years. In 1519, Elcano had set out with Ferdinand Magellan, c. 1480 to 1521, on a Spanish-sponsored expedition that became the first one successful in finding a western route to the east, having rounded the southernmost point of mainland South America. In 1520, and entering into the South Pacific, the expedition reached the Philippines in 1521. When Magellan was killed there, it was Elcano who took leadership of the crew and guided the expedition westward. Returning to Spain as the first sea captain to go around the world.
Who was the first to go around the world?
YC, the first to circumnavigate the globe was the Basque navigator Juan Sebastián de Elcano, c. 1476 to 1526, though 18 sailors who made the trip with him also claim the distinction. The trip was completed in 1522 and had taken nearly 3 years. In 1519, Elcano had set out with Ferdinand Magellan, c. 1480 to 1521, on a Spanish-sponsored expedition that became the first one successful in finding a western route to the east, having rounded the southernmost point of mainland South America. In 1520, and entering into the South Pacific, the expedition reached the Philippines in 1521. When Magellan was killed there, it was Elcano who took leadership of the crew and guided the expedition westward. Returning to Spain as the first sea captain to go around the world.
Who was the first woman to circumnavigate the globe?
It was a young French woman named Jean Barrot. In 1766 Louis-Antoine de Bougainville, 1729–1811, a French naval officer, undertook an around-the-world expedition, which was successful and returned to France in 1769. But the crew made an interesting discovery en route. When the French arrived in Tahiti, the Tahitians immediately noticed something the crew had not, that one of the servants on the expedition was a woman. Jean Barrot had been hired in France by one of the ship's officers, Khan, who also served as botanist for the expedition. Khmer Khan did not know Barrett was a woman. Her secret discovered by the Tahitians, she confessed, revealing that she was an orphan who had first disguised herself as a boy to get employment as a valet. When she learned about Bougainville's expedition, she decided to continue the disguise in order to carry out an adventure that would have been impossible for a woman in that day. She was the first woman known to have circled the globe.
Who was the first woman to circumnavigate the globe?
It was a young French woman named Jean Barrett. In 1766, Louis Antoine de Bougainville, 1729–1811, a French naval officer, undertook an around-the-world expedition, which was successful and returned to France in 1769. But the crew made an interesting discovery en route. When the French arrived in Tahiti, the Tahitians immediately noticed something the crew had not: that one of the servants on the expedition was a woman. Jean Barrett had been hired in France by one of the ship's officers, Khmer Khan, who also served as botanist for the expedition. Khmer Khan did not know Barrett was a woman. Her secret discovered by the Tahitians, she confessed, revealing that she was an orphan who had first disguised herself as a boy to get employment as a valet. When she learned about Bougainville's expedition, she decided to continue the disguise in order to carry out an adventure that would have been impossible for a woman in that day. She was the first woman known to have circled the globe.